The greatest 3 weeks in all of sports are here. March Madness has arrived. Johnny Sports Network here to provide you with my March Madness bracket. I do plan on filling out multiple brackets, but this bracket I fill out right here, right now, will be the bracket that I will use as my entry in my tournament challenge. As I am hosting a tournament challenge, I will provide the link to my tournament challenge in the description box if you'd like to join. I will admit, I spent more time looking at the bracket than I wanted to. I was going through all different kinds of scenarios. And without further ado, let's get to my bracket, starting things off in the East region. UConn, the defending champions, and Stetson. I felt like Stetson could be a 16 seed that was capable of taking down a 1, but I had to go with the defending champions on this one. I feel like this UConn team is too talented to lose to a 16 seed. Although there are no guarantees in March Madness, the moment UMBC upset Virginia, there was no more guarantees in March Madness, but I do think UConn moves on. The 8-9, FAU and Northwestern, a very challenging 8-9, although all the 8-9s are very challenging as they always are. But I think in this matchup, I think it comes down to which team I think is going to be coached better in this game. And I do think the experience that FAU had last year and going to the Final Four, they were so close to making it to the title game. I think the experience for FAU last year pays off. I think they move on to face off against the defending champions in round 2. San Diego State and UAB, the 5-12 matchup. We didn't have any 12 seeds upset 5s last year. I do think we get at least one 12 seed upsetting a 5 this year, but I don't think it's UAB over San Diego State. I'm going with San Diego State, one of the many teams like FAU that are out for redemption from last year. Auburn and Yale. Yale will be coming off of an emotional victory over Brown in the Ivy League Conference Tournament Championship game, while Auburn is coming off a dominant performance in the SEC Championship game. I'm going to go with Auburn. BYU and Duquesne. Duquesne in their first tournament in over 45 years, I believe 47 to be exact. And if Duquesne was against any other 6 seed, I would be open to picking them to pull off the upset, but not against BYU. I have been impressed with BYU all throughout the season. In their first year in the Big 12, I think they advanced around at 32. Illinois and Morehead State, the 3-14 matchup. I anticipated Morehead State would be a 14 seed, as I felt like if they got matched up with the right 3 seed, they had what it took to pull off a first round upset. But watching Illinois in this Big Ten tournament, I was really impressed with them. I think Illinois advances, even though the last couple of Big Ten conference tournaments, the winner of that tournament was eliminated in the round of 64, but I think Illinois ends that streak. And so far, I have not picked an upset yet, but I will right here. Washington State and Drake. And this, in my opinion, feels like the best 7-10 matchup of the first round. Or I should say the best 7-10 matchup of the tournament this year. I feel like both of these teams are very capable of going to at least the Elite Eight. As both these teams, I think, are for real. But I'm going to go with the upset. I'm picking Drake, Iowa State, and South Dakota State. For the last 3 years now, we have had a 15 seed upset a 2 seed in the first round. We've had a 15 seed advance to round 2 3 years in a row, and I was very tempted to pick South Dakota State over Iowa State to advance. But then I switched and I'm going with Iowa State to advance to round of 32. Although I do think South Dakota State, if they can hang in the game, if they can stay in it until about the last 3, 4 minutes, I think they can pull it off. But I'm going with the Cyclones. On to the West region, North Carolina and the winner of the playing game between Howard and Wagner. I do not think it matters who wins that playing game. And I'm going to go with North Carolina. Mississippi State and Michigan State. And it looks like this will be the game that begins the round of 64. And I think this is a very good matchup to start things off with. A Mississippi State team that has really flown under the radar, and a Michigan State team where there were people that said that they shouldn't be in the tournament, they didn't belong, but they got in anyways. I anticipated Michigan State would get in. I didn't know people were talking about how Michigan State would be left out. But if there was a coach that you can pick to have your team ready for the NCAA tournament, it would be Tom Izzo. One of the most experienced coaches in the tournament. I think Michigan State moves on. St. Mary's and Grand Canyon. And the 5-12 matchups, the other three of them that we have to still pick, they're very tough. The committee did a very good job this year, I should acknowledge. But I'm going to go with Grand Canyon to pull off the upset. I've been impressed with Grand Canyon throughout the year. And I believe Grand Canyon's made it the last couple of years. But I think this is when they get it done and move on to the round of 32. Alabama and Charleston. I am going to go with Alabama, although I do think that this game could be a very high-scoring game. I just think that it's going to come down to who can dictate the pace of the game better. I do think that'll be Alabama, because I do find them a much better team than Charleston, but not as much as people would think. I think Charleston keeps it close, just like they did against San Diego State last year in the first round. But that could be a 13-4 upset that nobody sees coming, but I'm not going to call it, though. Clemson and New Mexico. I have another upset. I am going with New Mexico. They were on the bubble going into conference tournament week, and they won the Mountain West tournament. The Mountain West Conference has done really well this season, as they have, I believe, 6 or 7 teams in this tournament. And I'm going with New Mexico. Baylor and Colgate. Colgate once again in the tournament winning the Patriot League. And I've said every year for the last couple of years that Colgate, they could pull off the upset. Colgate, I really buy into Colgate. And I want to do this by picking Colgate to pull off the upset, but I'm not falling for the trap this time. I'm not going back to that well. I am going to pick Baylor. Although now that I said this, I'm sure Colgate pulls off the upset now. Dayton and Nevada. And I'm going to go with Nevada. The Mountain West, I just feel like, is looking pretty strong going into this tournament. And people have talked about how the Mountain West isn't as good as people think, but San Diego State just made the championship game last year. And the final game of this region, Arizona and Long Beach State. I will say I'm rooting for Long Beach State. I think it'd be funny if they won, considering Long Beach State is being coached by a coach that was fired a week ago. But they're in the tournament. I'm going to pick Arizona. And moving on to the South region, Houston and Longwood. I'm going to go with Houston. Nebraska and Texas A&M. And this is a game that is getting a lot more hype than what it would have gotten if you were told that this would be an 8-9 matchup 3 weeks ago. Trev Alberts was the former AD for Nebraska. He left for Texas A&M days ago, and now they're facing off in the first round. Not only in the men's tournament, but the women's tournament as well. But I am going to pick Nebraska. You can see the shirt I'm wearing. I'm going to pick Nebraska to move on. Although this is a very emotional game for me, at least, because A&M's the team that I root for, and Nebraska just happens to be where I'm located. So yeah, it'll be a fun afternoon. We'll find a fun evening on Friday. Wisconsin and James Madison. I got to give Wisconsin credit. They looked lost about a month ago, but they have stormed back to get to a 5 seed. But I'm going to go with James Madison. I'm sure James Madison will be a very popular pick in the 12-5. And that does worry me a bit. I do think this is going to be one of those games that will go down to the wire. Duke and Vermont. I will be surprised if Duke is out this early in the first round, especially to Vermont. Texas Tech and NC State. This NC State team, it reminds me of the Virginia Tech team from a couple years ago, where they had to win the ACC tournament, and then they got in and they lost in the first round. And I think Texas Tech, I believe, is 18-0 or 19-0 this season when they allow less than 75 points. So I think NC State only gets about 62 or 63 points in this game. And I think Texas Tech advances. Kentucky and Oakland. I think Oakland will be a team that people will root for a Cinderella story, but I think Kentucky has it. Although Kentucky this year, in the last couple of years, it feels like Kentucky's a high risk, high reward pick. Florida and the winner of the playing game between Boise State and Colorado. I'm going to go with Florida for now, but I think depending on how this playing game plays out, I think if Colorado wins against Boise State, I think Colorado advances, but if Boise State wins, I'm going with Florida. So we'll see how that one plays out. Marquette and West Kentucky. Question is, will Tyler Kolek be ready for the tournament? Shaka Smart said that the plan is for him to play in the tournament. I think even without him, they'd be fine for this game. I'm going with Marquette despite Shaka Smart's bad history in the tournament, other than the Final Four with VCU. Purdue and the winner of Montana State and Grambling. I don't think it matters. I think Purdue, I think they learned from their mistakes last year. A chip on their shoulder. I think Purdue advances no matter who wins the playing game. Utah State and TCU. I'm going to go with TCU. TCU has been knocking on the door of the Sweet 16 for the last couple of years now, but they have fallen just short. I believe they even had leads in both of those games in the round of 32, but couldn't get the job done. Gonzaga and Nittany State. This is a very tough one, 50-50, but I'm going to go with the experience of Gonzaga. I just think Mark Few is the better coach in this matchup by a landslide compared to Will Wade. Kansas and Samford. I'm going with Samford to pull off the upset. Kansas just looks very vulnerable to me. I felt like Kansas was a serious championship contender about a month and a half ago, but this last month and a half, they look vulnerable and they're dealing with injuries. They could possibly be without Hunter Dickinson, and I do think with the pace that Samford plays, I think it could be a very exhausting evening for the Jayhawks. South Carolina and Oregon. I am going with Oregon, although South Carolina, they have flown on the radar this year. I am going to go with Oregon. Creighton and Akron, I am going with Creighton. Texas and the winner of the playing game between Virginia and Colorado State. I'm going to go with Texas, but depending on how I see these two teams in the playing game, I might change my mind on that. Many think that Virginia won't do anything in this tournament, which I think is a big reason why I'd want to pick Virginia to advance. Tennessee and St. Peter's, but I don't know about that one yet, by the way. St. Peter's back in the tournament as a 15 seed, but the St. Peter's team now is a lot different than a couple years ago. I'm going with Tennessee to advance. On to the round of 32. UConn and FAU. I think this could be a very close game, but I think UConn wins it at the end, if anything, worst case scenario. As I do feel like UConn is going to have a big test at some point in this tournament. I think it could be here, but I think that they advance the Sweet 16. I'm aware of the defending champions curse not making the Sweet 16 in a while, but I think UConn has what it takes to break that curse and end that streak. San Diego State and Auburn. If San Diego State wins, it could be a potential rematch of the national title game last year or a Final Four game if FAU pulls off the upset. But I'm going to go with Auburn, BYU, and Illinois. This one really felt iffy to me, but I am leaning towards the Illini. Drake and Iowa State. History shows that we do lose at least 1-2 seed in the first weekend. And I think Iowa State could be a candidate for that. I'm going to go with Drake to pull off the upset. I just think that this Drake team is on a mission. They were in it last year. They had Miami on the ropes, but Miami ended that game last year on, I believe, a 13 or 14 to 1 run in the last 3-4 minutes. North Carolina and Michigan State. Even though I do like Tom Izzo's experience, I do think the experience for North Carolina of not making the tournament last year, they will play the chip on their shoulder. I think the Tar Heels advance. Grand Canyon and Alabama. I was tempted to pick Grand Canyon, but I'm going to go with the Tide in this one, advancing to the Sweet 16. New Mexico and Baylor. I am going to go with the upset here. I'm going with New Mexico to advance to the Sweet 16. Nevada and Arizona. I am going to go with Arizona, although I do think that if Nevada, if they can slow the pace down in this game, I do think it could be trouble for Arizona. But I'm going with the Wildcats. On to the South region, round of 32, Houston and Nebraska. I'm going to go with Houston. I do think whoever wins the game between Nebraska and Texas A&M, I do think that's going to be a very emotional game. The stakes are going to be very high, and I think they lose focus, and I think Houston wins with a dominant second half performance. James Madison and Duke. I'm going to go with Duke. I think Duke advances the Sweet 16. Texas Tech and Kentucky. I was very close to picking Texas Tech to advance, but I changed my mind and I'm going with Kentucky. Florida and Marquette. I'm going to go with Florida. I just think Shaka Smart once again an early exit in the tournament. Purdue and TCU. As I mentioned a moment ago, TCU has been close to the Sweet 16 last couple of years. I do not think the third time will be the charm for TCU, but I think they could get it done. But this Purdue team, they are probably out for the most redemption of anybody else, even San Diego State and FAU. I think the Boilermakers advance. Gonzaga and Samford, I am going with Gonzaga. I do think that would be a fun game if that was the match that played out. Oregon and Creighton, Dana Altman coaching against his former team. And I am going to go with Creighton. Texas or the winner of Virginia and Colorado State against Tennessee. I'm going to go with Tennessee, though, to advance. On to the Sweet 16, UConn and Auburn. As much as I feel like Auburn does have Final Four upside, I am going to go with UConn. Although I'd not be surprised if Auburn did win this matchup, if this was the matchup. Illinois and Drake. I am going to go with the Illini. I think the Cinderella story ends here. North Carolina and Alabama. I think this would be a very high scoring game, but I am going to go with the Tar Heels. New Mexico and Arizona. I also think the Cinderella story ends here. I'm going to go with the Wildcats to advance to the Elite Eight, setting up Caleb Love playing against his old team. Houston and Duke. I would not be surprised if Duke did win this matchup, but I'm going to go with Houston. Kentucky and Florida. I'm going to go with Florida, although I will admit I do get more and more nervous as I advance Kentucky in this bracket, as I believe Kentucky hasn't made the Final Four since the year they had the super team that went undefeated and then lost to Wisconsin in the Final Four. Purdue and Gonzaga. I am going to go with Purdue in this matchup. I know we usually lose at least one seed. We lose at least one seed at before this point in the tournament, but I just feel like that these four teams have what it takes to advance to the Elite Eight. Creighton and Tennessee. I do think these two teams match up to each other very well, but I'm going to go with Creighton. And on to the Elite Eight. UConn and Illinois. I am going to go with UConn to advance to the Final Four. North Carolina and Arizona. Arizona has been a team that's been knocking on the door for the Final Four for years now, but they haven't been able to get there. But I'm going to go with North Carolina to advance. Houston and Kentucky. I am going to go with Houston. And the final matchup of the Elite Eight, Purdue and Creighton. I do think these two teams match up to each other very equally. And I think this will be a game where the 3-point ball will be going in for Creighton and it works for them in their favor. I think Purdue doesn't make it to the Final Four as they haven't under Matt Painter. I think the Blue Jays advance to the Final Four. And at my Final Four, UConn, North Carolina, Houston, and Creighton. And I do think a lot of people may think that this just feels like picking chalk because I have 3-1 seeds in the Final Four. And I was trying to think about what kind of tournament we're going to get. I feel like because we had a chaotic tournament last year where the Final Four felt completely random, I think we get more of a status quo tournament, but not exactly status quo. But in my Final Four, UConn and North Carolina. UConn did beat North Carolina in the regular season, and they say it's hard to win against the same team twice in the same year, but I'm going with UConn to advance to the championship game. Houston and Creighton. I think that this will be a game where the 3-point ball doesn't work for Creighton, and I'm like Houston to advance to championship night. And in the national championship, UConn and Houston, and winning the 2024 NCAA tournament, I have the Houston Cougars. I do feel like as far as which tournament we are going to get, I do feel like it'll be a combination of 2015, 2019, and 2021. More specifically, 2019 and 21. Because this Houston team reminds me of 2019 Virginia and 2021 Baylor, who happened to win those respective tournaments. As Houston, like Virginia and Baylor, before they won a championship, they were knocking on the door for years and years. Many thought they could be a serious contender, win a championship, but they had early exits, short of the Final Four, until one year, those two teams, they finally broke through and won the national championship. And I think that is what Houston does this year. And I know the last time we saw Houston was a bad performance in the Big 12 championship game. But when you see a team lose like that before the tournament begins, you can do one of two things. You can either A, fade them completely, or B, understand that the team they lost to in Iowa State, they won't be playing against them until potentially the national championship game. Or maybe Houston knew they'd be a 1 seed anyway, so they decided to rest their players, because you don't want to go all out in a conference tournament championship game when you know you're in and risk injury to key players. Comment your final four. Who do you have winning it all? Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.